Okay, right. So I think we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to the joint event by WORAN and People Analytics. And it's going to be a juicy one today, I think. So we're going to be talking about the gender pay gap. I am Shima Nuren. I'm a member of the WORAN Events Committee. I'm also a lecturer in business analytics at the Kent Business. I forgot my affiliations there for a second. Right, so what do we have in store for you today? We're going to start by a welcome thing, which I've already sort of begun. And we have a very interesting talk by Harminder, details of which I'll sort of provide in a minute. You'll be given the opportunity to ask questions or give feedback after her talk. So please make sure you either put whatever it is that you want to ask in the chat, and I'll try and put those questions to Harminder towards the end. Following on from Harminder's talk, we have an interactive session, which is going to have breakout rooms. And this session is going to be run by Katie Grona from the People Analytics group. And the aim of the session is to sort of explore the causes and the effects of the gender pay gap. And then we'll do a very quick feedback round and close the session. So a very quick thank you to WORAN's wonderful sponsors. You can see them towards the bottom of the slide. And I just want to say that we run events every month. So we have events. These events can range from discussions on different interesting topics, where we get the opportunity to share and learn from each other, build networks of people that we know, and mostly to also have fun. So please do come along to these sessions, and they're very widely sort of advertised. And before I continue, I just want to also say that our forthcoming event is taking place on June 23rd of June, and this is also going to be very interesting. The session is going to be exploring the gender bias in OR and analytics. And again, this is on the 23rd of June. So today's event, let's get the ball rolling. So we know that the gender pay gap is sort of much talked about. In essence, it is an indication of the sort of deep-rooted differences in earning power between men and women. So the event today will explore some of the issues that are associated with the gender pay gap. So first up, we have Harminder Maan. She's been working as a operational research analyst at the Department of Transport for about 3 years now. She has and continues to work on a wide range of analytical projects across the department, including using a variety of statistical and modeling methods on workforce and people data to support HR teams. Before this, she studied at the London School of Economics, where she did a BSc in Mathematics and Economics, and at the University of Kent, where she completed her MSc in statistics. So Harminder's will be talking about how her work on the pay gap answered particular questions that were being asked by the senior leadership team at the Department of Transport, how the work sort of went on to provide evidence for an action plan. So over to you, Harminder. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Shima. So I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can see the slides. So as Shima mentioned, I'm Harminder, so I thought I'd start by taking you through one of the projects that was undertaken by myself on the gender pay gap. And this was a piece of work exploring some of the causes and effects of different factors that contributed to the gender pay gap. So I work within a central analytical team in the Department for Transport, and this was one of the projects that came to us to help support the HR team. So in this presentation, I thought I'd start by introducing what the gender pay gap is and some background information into DFT as an organisation, before moving on to the analysis that was undertaken, focusing in on how we actually focused our analysis and how the approach we were taking was determined, some of the key themes and findings from the analysis, and then on to some of the challenges and approaches to communicate the gender pay gap. So on to the background and a bit about what is the gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap is the difference in average hourly pay between men and women in an organisation. So any organisation with more than 250 staff have been required to publish their gender pay gap figures annually since 2017 as part of the Equalities Act. And this includes government departments whose figures are published by the Cabinet Office. This is collated from data collected as part of the annual Civil Service Employment Survey, which covers all the government departments. And this would produce an average mean or median figure, which is used to represent the difference in hourly pay between men and women. So these figures use data for the month of March, and behind them are payments relating to gross salary, any additional allowances which might be awarded to members of staff, and bonuses for that month. I've included a link to the full gender pay gap report that's published by DFT, but all of the gender pay gap figures for across the government departments are published on the Cabinet Office page on the gov.uk website. So I thought before I go into the DFT gender pay gap, I thought I'd just give an overview about DFT as an organisation. So as you can see, it's not just made up of the core ministerial department. There are 4 executive agencies which also make up the DFT group. So this includes the DVLA, the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, the DVSA, Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency, MCA, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and finally VCA, the Vehicle Certification Agency. And as you can see, these all vary in size and provide different functions to help the department support its objectives. And across these, there are a number of different job roles. So in DFTC, the core ministerial department, you'll find roles similar to other departments. So this includes a range of corporate roles, which might be those in finance, HR, or analysis, policy development roles, as well as specifically to transport. This can include specialist roles in the air and maritime and rail investigation branches. I've also included some of the job roles which can be found in some of the agencies. So for example, driving examiners, and there's also enforcement staff in DVSA, as well as Coast Guard and marine surveyors in the MCA. And engineers can also be found in VCA. I've also provided, so there are also a range of staff at different grades. So this is used to represent the responsibility levels of staff. So I've provided the general terminology which is used across the civil service to describe the grade structure going from the more junior roles up until the senior roles. So when grade is referenced in this presentation, this is what it's referring to. I thought before I go into the details about the DFT's gender pay gap, I'd give a bit of an overview about the gender balance across the organisation. And as you can see, it varies across the organisations depending on which one you're looking at. So the overall for DFT group is close to gender parity, but I thought it's really important to highlight this because when understanding the gender pay gap, gender parity in terms of numbers of men and women does not necessarily mean that there will be no gender pay gap in an organisation, or that it will follow the same level. So on to the gender pay gap for the Department for Transport. So as I've previously mentioned, a mean and median figure is used to represent the gender pay gap. So I've provided some visuals here just highlighting for each organisation what the gender pay gap has looked like in 2020 and 2021, as well as the figures for DFT group. And as you can see, for DFT group, since between 2020 and 2021, the overall gender pay gap did reduce. And this was where our work came in. So we were asked to carry out some additional analysis by the HR team to help them understand the gender pay gap better, but also help them understand the different factors which might be contributing to this reduction. So before I go on to the analysis, I thought I'd give you a quick overview of the gender pay gap formula, so you have an idea of how it's calculated and what kinds of figures are included in it. So to calculate the hourly rate, it's essentially the March pay divided by the March hours worked. So as you can see, we adjust this according to FTE to account for different working patterns. And this won't just include figures for the covering someone's gross salary, it would it also be figures like additional allowances, which this can be any figure to do with shift premiums, or if someone's working short-term duties and having some deputising allowances paid onto their salaries, and it also includes bonus payments made for that month as well. So on to the analysis. So here I've just highlighted the different steps that we had to take before deciding on what analysis we were going to carry out. So first, identifying the data we had available and the initial area we wanted to focus on. And with 5 different organizations, we knew that we had 5 different data sets and each of these organizations had very different structures. So we knew that we needed some sort of analysis template where we could provide some initial insights and breakdowns into the data, but also gave us the ability to focus in on any key areas for an organization where we might want to a deeper understanding on an area. So an example of this could have included if we wanted to look into specific job roles for an organization, or look into different payments that were made and how these were having an impact on the gender pay gap for those organizations. So as we were asked to carry this out for each organization, we needed to determine which areas we wanted to focus on, and we wouldn't have had the time to focus on every single area. So we knew that we had 2 different data sources. One was the pay data behind the gender pay gap figures, and the other was data we already held on staff, which covered characteristics such as their grade, their job role, their working pattern, and much more. And we also had historical data and knowledge from previous gender pay gaps about the organisations. We knew that there were more men in senior roles and that some roles were attracting higher salaries. So we knew that the initial focus needed to be on exploring breakdowns by grade and job roles across the genders. We then decided to focus the analysis into the following areas to help understand what the different influences. The first being around pay disparity. So this included exploring and calculating gender pay gaps by grades, so by responsibility level, and for different job roles in the agency, so that we could get an understanding of the differences by grade and whether the gender pay gap existed in the more junior roles or senior roles or across the board in the organisations. Also, then going on to look at some of the staff data and understanding the distributions of staff. So understanding whether the proportion of men and women differed in each organisation and if this had changed in that period, and whether this was likely to be having an impact on the gender pay gap. We also decided to look at promotions and new starters over the period to understand if this was having an impact on a change in the distributions of staff. Although we knew this would be a small proportion of the overall numbers of staff, we thought this was important to look at because it could potentially be something to explore further in the long term to understand how the movements of staff could have potentially have an effect on the gender pay gap. So on to some of the key findings. So I've displayed here some of the key themes that we drew out from the analysis. So one was using the distribution of staff across the organisations to highlight why the gender pay gap exists in the first place. We knew that there were more men in senior grades, so there were more men being paid at the higher hourly rates. So that meant that the gender pay gap existed in the organisation. The chart I've shown here also shows the organisations and really highlights that in organisations such as DVLA and DVSA, there's a far larger proportion of junior roles in these organisations. And this was particularly important in highlighting that if we were to see changes in the DFT group overall, the median hourly rate, for example, would likely be within these roles in the organisation. So any changes that were seen in these roles would be reflected in the overall figure for DFT group. Around pay, we did explore the impact of additional payments made on salaries. So this was looking to understand whether changes in how awarding of allowances or bonuses could have had an impact between the period between 2020 and 2021. And then finally highlighting the technical and specialist roles and the impact of some of these on the gender pay gap breakdowns by grades to understand whether these were having, how much of an impact these were having. And we used methods like trying to exclude these from certain groups and recalculating the gender pay gap to understand what the impact is on the gender pay gap overall. So this analysis was used and presented in a variety of meetings to help HR leads and senior staff across the organisation understand the pay gap better. But we found, I thought I'd list out some of the challenges that came with this analytical approach. And we found that when completing this, we would often be presenting to different audiences. And this meant presenting different parts of the analysis and tweaking it to ensure that we were answering the right questions. So for example, when presenting to agency teams who were familiar with their data and their organisations, we were able to provide more detailed analysis around the different themes, and we could focus in on things like job role or grades or whichever theme was more relevant to their organisation. But when we were presenting to more senior leaders, we needed a more high level or quick impact summaries. So we found rather than splitting by organisation level, grouping into themes and using the organisations as examples was really helpful here, because it helped to illustrate the differences and also gave them quick summaries and quick ideas on what could potentially feed into their action plan. The next was often presenting to non-analysts who aren't familiar with how the gender pay gap is calculated and even what's included in the gender pay gap. So always ensuring that we had, whether it was a report that we were creating or a slide pack, that we had details about the formula or what was the figures that were included in the slides or annexes of that documentation. And finally, one of the bigger challenges was with 5 different organisations of varying structures and one overall gender pay gap figure, the question was quite often, how much is this having an impact on the overall gender pay gap? So it was really important that we highlighted the impact that the bigger organisations could have on the overall gender pay gap. And on the next slide, I've just covered some of the approaches that we took to do this. So we used a lot of quick calculations just to simulate some scenarios as to what the gender pay gap would look like if certain groups of individuals or if different hourly rates were applied to their salaries. So one thing that we did was just removing additional payments from the formula. This allowed the reader to see the difference between the gender pay gap if that was included and if it wasn't, to illustrate the impact of additional payments on the gender pay gap. And similarly, another method was just to exclude certain groups within certain grades where we knew that there was a difference. And this was really useful in highlighting the level of impact in terms of percentage this could possibly be having on gender pay gaps within certain grades, because we knew that those were the roles which may have been attracting higher salaries or where recruitment and retention allowances may have been applied to those salaries to keep staff in their roles. And finally, I listed a really quick, so when we were asked some really quick questions where we couldn't go and do the detailed analysis, we found one really useful method was calculating the gender pay gap and applying that same average hourly rate to all members of staff for their grade. And this was a really good way of illustrating what the gender pay gap would look like versus the actual gender pay gap, to understand that even if there was equal pay in the organisation, there was still a gender pay gap which would have been present because of there would still be more men in the more senior roles. And similarly with that approach, also changing the distributions of staff. So this was really useful when looking at DVLA and trying to applied a 50-50 split to their junior roles and then recalculated what the gender pay gap would look like if those roles had a 50-50 split. And this was really useful, not just to highlight the impact this could have, but also highlight to them that this would be something that would be seen in the longer term rather than in the next year, because these changes would require movement in the distributions of staff. So overall, this analysis was really helpful for the HR policy teams because it helped them provide them with some evidence to bring together their action plan. And as well as this, it also gave them a thorough understanding of their gender pay gap. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Harminda. That was really, really interesting. I've got one question in the chat. before I open the floor to others. So is the failure to account for non-gender worker characteristics the reason for gender pay gap?
So that, I mean, that could possibly be a reason for gender pay gaps, because there could be other external factors that are influencing the gender pay gap. So yes, there could be other things, even to do with recruitment or the staff leaving, which could be impacting as well.
Okay, thank you. And we've also got a very interesting discussion, I think, in the chat for whoever's interested about motherhood and how that tends to inform a woman's impetus to ask for a promotion. We've got a question from Catriona. Go for it.
Hi, I just wanted to say I thought your method of using the sort of average salaries to basically kind of get rid of structural differences within the organisation sounded quite interesting, because I think the gender pay gap often covers both.
Yeah, we found that was a really useful way of just displaying what it would look like if everyone within a grade was actually given the average for their rate, because it helped to show that even without it, because you've still got some more men in within certain grades, that there'd still be some gender pay gap there, but it's also something that's probably not realistic, because you'll always have differences in bonuses that are awarded to individuals, or differences depending on the additional allowances that they have. So you can't just have a standard gross salary, especially within the grades where there's a pay range rather than a specific rate at which they're at.
Thank you, Harminder. Any other questions? Okay. Don't think there are any more questions. Thank you so much, Harminder. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to the next bit of the event session. So we've got Katie's interactive session next. And just to introduce Katie, run out a little bit. So she studied at the Cardiff University, where she did a BSc in mathematics, then studied in University of Southampton, where she did an MSc in operational research, following which Katie joined the Government Operational Research Service in 1997. And with the exception of a 2-year secondment to the Department of Health, lead analytical support to the NHS blood and transplant, Katie has been a part of an internal consultancy in the Department of Transport, and she's been working on a wide range of analytical projects across the department and its agencies. For a number of years, a large part of her project portfolio was analysis and modeling to support HR operations and people strategy. And Katie has been the chair of the WORAN Society People Analytics Special Interest Group for 2 years now. Katie's current role is a head of the problem structuring and analysis team of the Department of Transport, and she is a co-founder of the Systems Thinking Interest Group, which is a cross-government network of people interested in using or finding out more about thinking. Now, the aim of Katie's session is to explore the cause and effects of the gender pay gap. And in particular, she's going to be considering intersectionality and how these changes affect the causes and effects. So over to you, Katie.
Okay, thank you, Shiva, for the introduction, and thank you, Harminder, for that talk. And that's going to sort of set the scene for what we're going to talk about now. So the aim was to think about the causes and effects, but it's also a chance for you to get into breakout groups and have a chance to talk about your experiences and your knowledge and what you think about this topic as well. So Karen is going to set up some breakout groups which you'll be able to, well, you'll be pushed into shortly, sort of 5 or 6 in a group. And I've put a link in the chat to the mural board, which we will use collectively to bring together our thoughts, and we'll look back at that at the end. Hopefully someone in each group will be able to use it. If you can't, don't worry, just have a discussion however you want to within your group, and we'll bring it all together at the end. So from Harminder, you've heard about some of the things we in Department of Transport looked at in our analysis, and we were limited by what we had data on. And I think the comments that came in the chat reflect that there's lots of other things that are going on that drive that gap. It's the pay is the bit you see, and there's a whole load of stuff that happens before you get to that point that makes that difference. we had to look at the data we had and also what was in control of within the control of our organisation. We couldn't write an action plan that that had something that was 20 years lead in time and completely outside of our control to influence in our action plan. It needed to be something we could actually work on as an organisation. So we did do some systems thinking before we started to think about what are the drivers of the gender pay gap. It was quite a structural, sort of almost like a process map to understand, well, these are the different things that need to happen for people to get higher or lower salaries and so on. But we also thought a bit wider as well. And the idea of this session is to just take that a bit further and bring in all your views on as to what causes that gap. It's a much wider and much more complex issue than the things we were able to look at. I mean, Harminder didn't go into the detail about some of the real issues we had in ours, which is around some of the roles that attract the retention and recruitment allowances, which is about as much flexibility as the government gets to pay people more. It's not a lot of flexibility. Most people are on a very fixed salary range, tend to go to the specialist jobs, that the engineers, the surveyors, which are predominantly male in just historically they are. So that is feeding into the gender pay gap. And then transport as an industry has been predominantly and historically quite male dominated. So there's that as well to deal with. Anyway, so I'll just talk you through what we're going to do. I'll share my screen. Bear with me. Hopefully you'll be able to see this in a minute. Can you see a red and white board on the screen? Yes, great, thanks for the thumbs up. So this is a mural board. I've put the link in, I'll resend that again in a minute. What we're going to do, there's a little bit, once you're in, if you want to just have a practice, there's some post-it notes in this section 1 where you can just grab one, write your name, or you can use the tools at the side to drag and drop a sticky note, or just click on one. But what we're going to explore is the questions over here. So we're trying to bring in your experience and knowledge to this discussion about the causes and effect of the gender pay gap. So I've sort of taken the PESTLE model to think about some areas for us to focus on. So I'm focusing on the political, so the taxation regime, government policies, etc., that might help or hinder. What social factors are there? How does technology influence this? And then the other one I picked up on is economic. What economic factors have an impact on it, or are impacted by it? So there's some questions there you can think about. So yeah, what structural issues? What's in place now that it's just it's really hard to break out of? That means that there's a gender pay gap. How does culture and society play into it, and what are the impacts on culture and society? Then we mentioned intersectionality, so we're just looking at gender here, but what else is going on? I mean, are there other compounding factors for other protected characteristics, disability, race, etc., that could have an impact on this as well? And does technology have an impact? And other economic drivers for this as well. So that's some questions to think about. What I want you to then do is I've adopted the connection circle canvas from the Systems Innovation Network. There's a link here. It's a really good place if you want lots of different canvases and tools to explore things for brainstorming, for systems thinking. I highly recommend going to have a look. But what we've got further down here then is a big circle, and there's a quadrant, if you like. So we've got political, technological, social, and economic. And in your groups, if you want to just think of some of the things, it doesn't really matter how you write it, just something that you think is either a cause or an effect of the gender pay gap. So if the DFT, it might be lack of women entering the engineering profession, for example. Now you think, well, it doesn't matter if you don't have to put it in the right quadrant, it might go in more than one, just get it on there. It's just an idea of trying to help structure that to start with. Anything you can think of, stick them in there in your groups. and then we'll see what we come up with, and I'll do a bit of reflection at the end as to what comes out and see if I can draw any themes out. Is that okay? Is there any questions from anyone? Now's the time to shout if you've got any questions, or type in the chat. Okay, I should open the chat, that would help. Assuming that's all right then. So Karen, could you put us in our groups, please? And then what time are we coming back, Shima?
20 or 25?
Okay.
Yeah, 20, I think, to give you enough time to summarize. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Karen. Hopefully that was useful, just to have a chance to chat about this and think about the complexity of this. It's really not straightforward. There's so much that's tied up and so much that is built into the way we do things, that changing it is really hard, but also measuring it is really hard, and understanding what's driving it. And we didn't, I don't know, in our group, we didn't even start to think about what would be the impact of it if there was a gender pay gap. Why is that a bad thing? You know, what and so what? Just, you know, on a level for equality, fine, but what is the actual impact of a gender pay gap? So that's a whole other thing to explore. What does that mean? So looking at what we've got, I can share my screen if, for those who haven't seen it, can't see it. Again. Hopefully you can see that. So I think most of the groups started off around the social sector quadrant, and that's where a lot of the barriers to women's progression, getting same access to the same types of jobs as men seems to come in. So there's things here about the types of roles people are doing, the childcare, motherhood, other cultural and social structures and things that are in place that mean that the expectations for women are different. Some of the processes don't fit so well to enable women to progress, and so on. There's also some down the bottom around the economic and so what certainly in our group, one of the things we talked about was location as well around that, and where people work, and that can have an impact both on their salary anyway. They may earn the London jobs may attract more men for whatever reason, the national jobs may not. And then the sort of turnover rates, how often people move on and so on. And then we've got something in the technology around a growth in demand for technical roles might help or hinder gender pay gap in future, unless something happens to prepare more women to go into those technical roles and make them want to do them, then there's going to be an even greater disparity in future if those technical roles get paid more. So it's also, they could also say it's around what society values, isn't it? If they're going to pay more for a role that's technical, is that because there's fewer people? Is it to do with market, or is it to do with some sort of status that's attached to those roles? Traditionally, caring roles don't get paid very much, and they tend to be women that do those roles, and they're not given possibly the status they deserve. And then we got around the political, as we discussed some of what does that mean by that, and it could be the political climate within an organisation, it could be government and national structures. I didn't really mean political with a big P necessarily. I wasn't about to get into a discussion about the politics of different politics on the gender, but so that, and there's some discussion around how the definitions for reporting can obscure what's actually going on, and you might be arguing over what you're counting when actually you should be thinking about what you do about it. So is a measure for the sake of a measure, is that useful? If anyone's got anything else they want to add to my summary, then please chip in, either in the chat, so I've just noticed there's some things in the chat.
I just want to say that we had a really, really interesting discussion. I think Bella and Harminder and one other person, we had a really interesting discussion about the differences in from academia versus industry, I suppose. And so we discussed how we experience these things and how it differs from how the industry sort of dealing with these issues. We had a really good discussion, didn't we, Bella?
Good. All right. I can see you've just shared the feedback, link to the feedback.
I have indeed. I just one other thing that I wanted to share, sort of signpost to another event. If I could, there we are, before we end. So I've been asked to talk about the free workshop that's being hosted by the Fawcett Society, and they're hosting it in collaboration with this. I think it's something called as VALA, so it's free for you to join, and the workshop sort of teaches you how to label, address, and take action against discrimination. And I think VALA is one of the first UK's organizations that does deal with these issues. So please, if you want to join or if you want to sign up, please do. And I think this has been a very interesting session. I personally had a lot of fun. So if you're not a member of WORAN, and if you'd like to be, please sign up. And you should have received the feedback survey in the chat. Please do take a minute or two to fill in that feedback form. And many thanks to Karen for helping us set up the event, and for Katie for collaborating with us, and to the OR Society. And thank you to all of you for attending, and hopefully we'll see you on the 23rd for the next event. Thank you so much.
Okay. And can I get a quick plug in? We've got the People Analytics Special Interest Group next event is on the 15th of June. So look at it, you should get emails out about that. It's around wellbeing and how we measure wellbeing. So that's what our next topic will be on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.